Anything Ghost, number 244. 12 years of Anything Ghost. One doesn't get any creepier than that. Welcome to Anything Ghost. My name is Lex Wall, and this is episode number 244, the 12th anniversary of Anything Ghost. Anything Ghost is a place where people share their personal paranormal experiences, and I share them with you over the show. If you have one you want to share, send them to lex@anythingghost.com. And here comes show number 244, the 12th anniversary of Anything Ghost. The story is from Slaba in Russia, Dark Russian House. From my birth until I was 9 years old, I lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, a living room, a long hallway, a sunroom, a basement, and a small room inside of the basement. I shared the house with 2 sisters, 1 brother, and my mom. My father had passed away when I was just over a year old. The house had a strange design to it. 2 of the sides shared a thin wall with 2 other houses, as if a large mansion had been divided into 2 smaller houses that still connected. It almost was like an apartment, except we had a fenced-in front and side yard. The exterior of the house was made from dark red brick. One of the most memorable things about this house was that I was always afraid of being alone in the home. I constantly felt that there was something hiding in the walls of the house. Something that was there long before my parents or me. The first experience that I can remember happened on a warm summer night. That night I woke up to use the bathroom that was located on the opposite side of the house. A long hallway separated us from that bathroom. I didn't want to turn on the light in the hallway, as it was very bright, and the street light was coming through the window at the end of the hallway, so that was enough for me. As I was making my way down the hallway, I slowed down as I was passing the kitchen. For a moment, I felt that there was someone there. I couldn't see much, except for dim light reflecting on the refrigerator and an empty olive glass bottle. After a quick glance toward the kitchen, I decided to resume my normal speed and continued my way toward the bathroom. At that very moment, the empty glass bottle flew off the table as if somebody had knocked it down. The idea of someone or something hiding in the kitchen and possibly watching me made me run straight to the bathroom and lock the door behind me. It took about 30 minutes for me to get all my courage back, and I made my way back to the bedroom. Another occurrence took place sometime later. One night I was awakened by the sound of some running in the living room. I looked at the gap between the door of my bedroom and the floor, and could not see any light coming from the living room. The running continued for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then stopped. The next morning, my brother came to me and said he had spotted something strange in the living room. Upon entering the living room, I saw child-sized dirty footprints on the bottom of the walls. Instead of shoe prints, these looked like child's dirty socks had made prints on the wall. The footprints continued up the middle of the wall and up toward the ceiling. I told my brother that the night before I had heard running in our living room, to which he replied that he had also heard running a few times before. Other occurrences included cabinets in the kitchen that would open by themselves and knocks on the door that separated the sunroom from the rest of the house. In the beginning, I mentioned that my father passed away when I was a little more than a year old. One night, he came to me in a nightmare. In my dream, I woke up in my bed. As I was getting out, I noticed that there was a table right in front of my bed, and on that table was a coffin. The coffin was dressed in red fabric, which in Russia means that a young or middle-aged person had passed away. For some reason, I knew right away that it was my father. I got up a little closer to the coffin. At that moment, my father rose up from the coffin and began to stretch his arms toward me as if he wanted to grab me. I jumped out of the bed and tried to run away. At the moment my father nearly reached me with his hands, I woke up. I don't remember how much time passed before I fell asleep again, but I remember that I laid there frozen, not making a single sound or moving a muscle. My mother never talked about my father. His death remains a partial mystery to me. While living there, my mother forbade us from going into the small room located in the basement. And as long as I can remember, there's always been a big padlock on the door of that room. In the past few months, with the help of my brother, I've been doing some research into that home, and I found that it was not built in the 1950s or 1960s, as I'd first thought. It was built in the 1850s. In addition, the house I lived in was part of a much bigger house that was later divided into 4 separate living spaces. I don't know much about who built the house, but it was most likely built by a wealthy family then, during the October of 1917 revolution, and that they were forcefully evicted from the house by the Bolsheviks. There are no records of what happened to the family after the eviction. My grandmother once told me that the people who lived there before my parents had a baby. However, the newborn disappeared. Rumors circulated that the mother of the newborn baby buried it alive, presumably because she could not take care of it. It's been over a decade since I've seen my childhood house. After my family moved out, no one else moved in. The last I heard, the house has been transformed into a storage for nearby businesses. Part of me really wants to go back to that house and look around, in hope of finding some answers about my childhood paranormal experiences. The next story we have is from Steve in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Haunt me if you can. The following story was relayed to me by my brother. When I was 7 years old, we lived in an old farmhouse in Wisconsin. The house was next door to an old church cemetery, and although the small country church was long gone, the cemetery was still in use. Century-old monuments mixed with the more modern low-to-ground markers. Many days I would run around the cemetery with my dog Taffy. I would try to read the worn inscriptions on the old tombstones, run around, climb the trees, just generally having a good time for a 7-year-old. In one corner of the cemetery there was a collection of 4 rectangular tombstones laid flat on the ground in an open area. While I knew every corner and stone of the place, strangely, I would never play in that corner. I never had any odd feelings or felt any threat, but whenever I intended to go there, something would always distract me. Early one August, I got the crazy idea to go to the cemetery at night to try to see a ghost. So one night, after being put to bed, I snuck out of the house and brought Taffy with me. I never kept Taffy on a leash. She would always stay within 100 feet of me, no matter where I went. The moonlight was bright enough to see, so I didn't even bring a flashlight. And by that point, I was so used to the cemetery that I wasn't afraid at all. To me, it was just a neat adventure. After a little thought, I decided the best way to see a ghost was to insult them in some way. So I jumped up and down on a couple of ground-level tombstones, then waited. Nothing happened. The quiet night was only broken by the sounds of crickets and Taffy sniffing around in some tall grass looking for mice. So I tried stomping on the graves themselves, demanding loudly to be haunted. I waited. Still, nothing happened. Disappointed, I gave up and went home. 2 nights later, I decided to try it again. Same as the first night, I snuck out of the house and brought Taffy along. I stomped on some graves and again demanded to be haunted. Taffy was only a few yards away. What happened next is a bit hard to describe. I was facing the corner of the cemetery, where the 4 tombstones lay flat on the ground, the corner I never went into. The crickets went silent, and the air above the corner changed. The best I can describe it was that it was like the air froze, then cracked. Taffy was instantly alert, then immediately bolted away. A fraction of a second later, I followed her, somehow sensing that some kind of thing was in the air above, chasing after me. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I actually beat Taffy back to the house. I darted inside and slammed the door behind me. I could sense that the thing was now flying around and around the whole outside of the house. Then I heard a panicky growl and a scratching at the door. Taffy was still outside. I let her in, and she immediately wrapped herself around my legs, shivering. At that point, my mother was awake and came down, wanting to know what on earth was going on. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw how terrified Taffy was. She knew something was up, which was not surprising, since other things had happened in that house. She told me to get back into bed. By the time I was back in bed, I no longer felt any presence outside at all. I fell asleep quickly. Needless to say, I never asked to be haunted again. And that's the end of my brother's story. At that time, I was only 3 years old, but we lived in the house next to the cemetery until I was 6. There was one time that I saw a face looking in a window that was 8 feet up. Another time, my brother was in the yard and saw a face looking out from a window in a room that we never used. I don't know why. We all had to share bedrooms, and that one room was only used for storage. There was something wrong with that house. A story from Natalie in New Mexico. The Lawman in Cimarron, New Mexico. Over the summer, I worked full-time at a scout camp in northeastern New Mexico. The camp itself was enormous, over 200 square miles if I remember correctly, and a few miles away from the main campsite is a town called Cimarron. Cimarron is tiny, with fewer than 1,000 permanent residents. It's a cute old town that dates back to the lawless days of the Old West. Both camp and the town, therefore, have plenty of ghost stories. The outlaw Blackjack Ketchum had a hideout in the mountains where I worked, and the main hotel in town hosted people like Jesse James, Clay Allison, and plenty of shootouts and deaths. I worked in the mountains all summer, but the most supernatural event happened in the hotel when I stayed there for a night with some visiting family on my day off. Each room in the hotel is named after an outlaw or lawman that stayed at the hotel, and the room I split with my brothers was named after a lawman who had died there. The room was small and very old-looking, to fit with the theme of the town. My bed was narrow, lumpy, in a fun old-fashioned way, and it looked like it had been pulled out of the early 20th century. Being a history buff, I was absolutely thrilled. While I wandered around the hotel a bit before bed, I heard footsteps behind me. So I took some photos. My pictures all showed a weird grouping of 5 balls of light. I was a little spooked and jokingly told my brothers that I only wanted to see friendly ghosts that night. We all fell asleep, and at around 3 a.m., at some point during the night, I woke up to a sudden pressure on my legs, like something was holding them down. Now I am an active sleeper, and thought that my legs had been tangled in the blankets, so I opened my eyes to free up my legs. When I looked at the foot of my bed, standing there was a large, dark figure, too big to be either of my brothers. As I watched, I didn't feel scared, just kind of confused. The pressure on my legs lifted, even though I hadn't moved at all. Like I said, I was surprisingly calm through this, and my problem solved, I muttered a "thank you" and rolled over and closed my eyes. Then I slowly began to realize what I had just seen, and a second later I opened my eyes again, but saw nothing at the door. I managed to get some sleep because I was almost unnaturally calm. The next morning, while I was telling my brothers the story, I realized that perhaps it was the ghost of a lawman or some other good person who had been killed there and was waiting to oblige my desire to see a friendly ghost. It's a story from Katarina in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Growing up ghostly. We lived in a raised bungalow. What would be considered the basement was fully renovated into another living space, kitchen, living room, bedroom, and bathroom. My grandmother lived with myself and my mother and father. She had the basement, and my parents and me had the main level. Growing up there, I would sleepwalk, have night terrors, and see shadow figures. Sometimes, as I stood in the living room and looked down the hallway, which even during the day, if the lights were out, was very dark because there were no windows, I would often see a tall, lanky shadow figure slide from my bedroom and into my parents' room. At one point in my childhood, my night terrors got so bad that my mother piled blankets at the foot of her bed for me to sleep on, because I would call and call for them to stay in my room while I slept. I was getting too big to sleep between them, but I didn't mind sleeping at the foot of their bed. At that time, my parents would leave the bedroom doors open because our 2 cats would cycle between sleeping in their room and in the living room. I remember waking up one night, sleeping on the pile of blankets, and looking across the hall into my bedroom. I had a clear visual shot of the chair in my room, where my dad would often sit in while waiting for me to fall asleep. Sitting in that chair was a dark mass. I could only make out a head and shoulders. I threw the covers over my head and remained that way until I eventually fell asleep. I eventually ended up sleeping downstairs with my grandmother because that was the only place where I didn't see the shadow figure. But even with my grandmother, if I woke up late at night, I would hear footsteps above us on the main level, pacing around. When I asked my mom in the morning about why her and Dad were awake at 3 a.m. pacing around, she would tell me that neither of them were doing that. Fast forward a few years. We moved into a new house in Ottawa, Ontario. I was 15, and I was thrilled to leave that other house. By that age, I had taken an interest in horror movies. I felt less alone knowing that, obviously, what I was experiencing was real enough to be turned into TV shows and movies. But the new house was no better than the last, and to this day, I don't do well there. My parents never experienced anything in the old house, and they still don't understand what I'm so afraid of at the current house in Ottawa. However, friends that would stay over during my high school years, and even now, tell me stories of seeing a shadow figure move around the house. One of the scariest situations I ever experienced in this house was only a few months ago. On the second floor, my bedroom and the guest room are across from each other. One night, for a change of scenery, I decided to sleep in the guest room. Now, the way my bedroom is set up is that the bed is pushed against the wall, opposite of the door. When my door is open, I can see across the hall and into the guest room. I have the exact same view of my bedroom when I lay in the guest bed. It was fairly early into the night as I began to crawl into bed, but I began to feel extremely uneasy, as if being in the guest bed was the worst thing I could be doing, like I was crossing some imaginary boundary line. Trying to ignore it, I snuggled into the blankets. That's when I looked into my unlit bedroom. In the bed in my room, I saw a person facing away from me. More specifically, a girl. I could make out very clearly long black hair spread across my pillow and shoulders under my blankets. My blankets were a dark purple, but I could see the difference in texture of the even darker hair against my blankets. I began to scream and I called for my dad. My dad came running up to see me, but when I got up to look in my room, my bed was completely flat and the blankets untouched. No shape of a sleeping girl on her side. Since that night, I sleep in my own bed with the door closed, and I burn sage every night before bed. I could talk for days about the things I experienced on a weekly basis, but I'll tell you one more brief experience. I've been with my current boyfriend for about 3 years, and he's been around the house here in Ottawa for quite some time, even before we started dating. He's grown up with ghostly, unexplained experiences, so he's pretty good at handling the things he experiences in my house. Our main level has 3 rooms off the hallway and entrance, but once it opens up into the kitchen, the sunroom and dining room are side by side. Gavin and I were sitting in the sunroom, and from there we had a clear view of the dining room, kitchen, and the hallway to the front door. It was just before 6 p.m., and Gavin and I were chatting. My mom was in the kitchen prepping food, and my dad was standing and talking to her. Suddenly, Gavin stopped his story and asked me, "Who else is here?" Confused, I shook my head and said, "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Nah, nothing. Don't worry about it. I don't want to spook you." Since the girl in my bed incident, I prefer not to discuss whatever we see in the house, because I don't want to give it power. But being stubborn, I told him I wanted to know. He replied, "I saw someone walk from the study and across the hallway into your dad's office." At night, when you're alone in that home, the place takes on a weird feeling. You feel the need to run up the stairs. You don't want to leave the lights off, and any noises make you jump. The lights often flicker and dim, despite my dad constantly checking the electricity. It's not an old home, it's probably 10 years old, which makes me wonder if whatever was with me in the previous home followed us 4 hours to Ottawa. I also find it unusual that my parents and my grandmother never experienced anything in Toronto, and my parents still have yet to experience or see what I do in our home in Ottawa. But all my friends can vouch, and so can my boyfriend Gavin. I smudge my room every night while mentally asking whatever force is with us to leave my family and me alone. I would also like to note that I still get really bad night terrors, and sleep tests are unable to figure out why. Next story is from Deirdre in Charlotte, North Carolina. Haunted North Carolina apartment. About 10 years ago, before we bought our house, I moved in with my boyfriend. He had been living in an apartment for about a year and a half, but had never mentioned anything paranormal happening to him. However, once I moved in, things started moving. The first time I remember it happening, we were sitting in the living room looking at the computers. We didn't have much furniture at the time, so our machines were set up on a long folding table, and we shared a long bass speaker cabinet as a seat. I was sitting on the right side. I turned to face my boyfriend. I was looking into the small cubby cutout of the wall that allowed you to see into the kitchen. There was a small bar area there where you could put maybe 2 to 3 stools. That night, I had left a bottle of nail polish on the end of the bar. I turned to say something to my boyfriend, and when I looked at him, the bottle of nail polish slid like someone had pushed it, stopping a little more than halfway across the countertop. My boyfriend heard the sound, and it made him quickly turn around. The second time it happened, I was on the phone with my dad. I was sitting on the sofa, which also allowed me to look through the opening into the kitchen. My boyfriend was leaning on a bit of the counter where I'd seen the nail polish move. We kept our trash can in a closet that was almost too small to accommodate it. Therefore, when you closed the closet door, you really had to put some weight into it if you wanted it to click shut. On this afternoon, the door was open maybe 3 to 4 inches. We both watched it close, and we heard the little latch slide into place. The final thing that happened there, I wasn't home to see. My boyfriend was home for the afternoon while I was working. He went into the bathroom to shower, and as he was getting undressed, he thought he heard me come in the door. He called out, thinking I had come home for lunch, but he didn't receive a reply. He was about to start the water when the doorknob to the bathroom started violently shaking, like someone was trying to get into the room. My boyfriend is the kind of guy who always locks the bathroom door, out of habit, so the door will stay closed. He called out my name again and opened the door, only to find the apartment empty. I never felt threatened by any of these occurrences, though if I had been the one in the bathroom, home alone when the doorknob rattled, I might have freaked out quite a bit. The presence always felt very playful, like it was trying to show off or entertain us. To this day, I still wondered what caused these things to move in that place. Since we've moved into our house, everything has been completely quiet, but I kind of miss that playful presence. So we're now entering 12 years of Anything Ghost. It was created by me in 2006. And if you'd like to hear every single episode plus some of all those 12 years of Anything Ghost, you need to join the Anything Ghost VIP group. For more information, go to www.anythingghost.com and then go to the Join the VIP group page. That's the Anything Ghost VIP group, anythingghost.com, join the VIP group, and you'll have complete access to the 12 years of Anything Ghost. A story from Megan in Hillard, Ohio. Robin and the Ring. I was sitting at home watching TV one night after work and was putting lotion on my hands. I work in an animal shelter and am constantly washing my hands. They get incredibly dry. I had to set my wedding rings on my lap in a blanket. At some point I dozed off. I woke up kind of groggy and I trudged up to my bed. My rings folded into the blanket forgotten about for the moment. I woke up the next morning and realized that I didn't have my rings. I remembered that I'd taken them off, and they must be folded into the blanket. I went to go get them and found my wedding band, but my engagement ring was nowhere to be found. My family is just my husband and me and our cats and dogs, so there's nobody who could have walked away with it. We looked, nowhere. I opened the blanket, checked the couch cushions. It just wasn't there. I wasn't too alarmed, because I thought it would turn up shortly. There was nowhere else it could have gone. 6 months later, I still hadn't found my engagement ring. I still looked for it often, and was pretty upset with myself. Every single day, I looked at my hand and saw the missing ring. As I mentioned, I work in an animal shelter. We have both staff and volunteers who split the cleaning duties. I had become pretty good friends with a girl named Robin. We both had an experience dealing with medical problems and would bond over shared stories of treatments and hospital stays. However, hers was very much more ongoing, as she lived with cystic fibrosis. At 32 years old, she had already outlived her life expectancy, especially being so active to help at the animal shelter. But as time went on, she started to take more and more time away and was admitted to a hospital on a few occasions. We would text and email, and once I took her a care package and a card from everyone at the shelter. I only saw her a few times at the shelter after her last hospital stay, and on September 27th, she passed away. September 27th is also my birthday, and of course that year it came and went quietly as we were all mourning the loss of a very good friend. A few days later, my husband and I were at home, and I was visibly upset about Robin. He hugged me as I cried about it. I missed her, and I couldn't believe it. She passed away on my birthday. I collected myself after a few minutes, and I went to take care of the laundry. As I was moving stuff from the washer to the dryer, I pulled the stuff out and stood up and saw my engagement ring sitting on the dryer rim, right in front of my eyes. I stared at it for a minute. I couldn't believe it. How many loads of laundry had I done in 6 months? The couch blanket had not recently been washed. There was absolutely no doubt in either of our minds that Robin found my ring for me. Thank you, Robin. It was the best birthday present I could have received that year. I hope you're okay, wherever you are, my friend. You are loved and missed. Story from Dee in Wyoming. Ghost at the Huntington Library. This is not my story, but my mother's and my sister's. Years ago, my mother was visiting my sisters in Southern California. They decided to go visit the Huntington Library in San Marino. One of the displays that was there at that time was a room that had been in a medieval English castle and had been completely disassembled and reassembled in the library. Being in Southern California, the temperature in the library was strictly controlled. For those of you who are not familiar with the Huntington Library, it houses many fine works of art, including Gainsborough's Blue Boy and Pinky by Reynolds. They entered the English castle room, and my mother, who was a skeptic, felt immediately uncomfortable. She said her skin went clammy, and she started to get an upset stomach. The room temperature, she felt, was colder than the rest of the library and kind of damp. She knew that couldn't be right, since the air conditioning in the library controlled the humidity, and it was Southern California in July. We are from Michigan, and she said the air in the room felt like a damp November day. She noticed that my sisters were transfixed, staring at the fireplace area, where 2 chairs had been situated on either side of the hearth. She tugged one of my sister's arms, mentioning that She wanted to leave, but she couldn't seem to get their attention. Mom was at the point where she felt like she was going to throw up, and she decided to leave to find a bathroom. She left my sisters standing there and walked into the hall. As soon as she left the room, she immediately felt better. Her nausea was gone, and the temperature returned to normal. She found a bench and waited for my sisters. When my sisters finally came out about 5 minutes later, they asked my mom why she left and asked her if she saw that guy. There had been no one else in the room with them, so my mom asked them what guy they were talking about. It turns out that what my sisters had been staring at was a man standing by the fireplace in complete Elizabethan garb. He had not moved while they were standing there, so they thought maybe it was a worker or a mannequin. But when they went back in, he was gone. They asked an employee about it, and the employee said no one working there had been dressed like that. The employee also noted that the room gave her the creeps, and she avoided going in there as much as possible. Is it possible that there was a stowaway when the room was moved from England to California? A story from Rowan in the Philippines. Uncle returns. Me and a friend of mine decided to go watch a movie. That particular week was so stressful, both physically and emotionally, that we decided to treat ourselves to a movie. We went to one of the popular malls in Manila and checked out the available films. After we decided on what movie to watch, we bought our tickets and snacks and were waiting for the attendant to let the patrons inside. At that time, my friend tapped me on the shoulder. I looked at her, and she replied to me, "You see that guy? That guy over there?" I looked in that direction she pointed, and the guy was wearing khaki shorts, a blue and white polo shirt, and a baseball cap. "Yeah, why? What's with him?" I asked my friend, confused why she looked a little pale. "I saw him at the entrance earlier, then in the line for tickets, at McDonald's, and now here," she whispered to me. I was about to reply when the line started to move and the attendant took our tickets. My friend and I decided to sit in the orchestra seats. After we settled in our seats, I noticed that the guy that my friend had pointed out was seated directly in front of us. Actually, directly in front of her. I was sure he wasn't there when we checked if our seats were available, and it seemed impossible for him to get there that quickly. The movie started, and I'd already forgotten about this guy. Halfway through the movie, my friend clutched my arm really tight. I looked at her and was taken aback when I saw how scared she looked. I asked her what was wrong, but she just pointed her shaky finger at a spot on the theater stage. I looked to where she pointed, and to my surprise, I saw that guy that we'd seen earlier standing under the light of the fire exit. Both of us couldn't speak. Then my friend began to mutter something about her uncle. She told him to leave us alone and to please rest now. The movie ended without us two paying much attention. We ended up having lunch when she explained. 3 weeks ago, an uncle of hers had died, 1 week after the birth of his son. He was shot by an old friend of theirs, and thankfully the killer was abducted. After this uncle had died, his wife kept seeing him. He was wearing the same clothes he wore when he was killed: khaki shorts, a black and white polo shirt, and a baseball cap. His wife told her that the deceased man has made visits to her grandmother, her other aunts and uncles, her mom and dad, and other cousins. She had never seen her uncle and thought that he would never show himself to her. But apparently, that day, he did show himself.
Hello, Lex. My name is Susan, and I love your show. I'm calling from North Carolina, and I've decided it's finally time for me to send you a story since I've listened, I think, to almost all of your stories. So here's one of my stories. In the middle of the 80s, my new husband and I were asked if we might consider living as house parents in a sorority on the campus of the nearby university. A woman he worked with was a sister and an alumna of the university, and she suggested we give it a try. It seemed like a silly offer, but then we learned about free room and board and a stipend for our work, so we reconsidered. We were in our mid-20s and saving for a down payment to eventually purchase our own home. We were both recent art school grads and not at all familiar or particularly interested in Greek life on college campuses. We were actually very naive and had no idea what we were going to step into. Responsibilities for the house parent job included managing a cook, a maid, and kitchen help, plus general maintenance of the property. We were also responsible, of course, for the keeping the girls safe, which was the hardest task. We both had jobs, mine was part-time, and we felt like we could handle the duties required. As a further enticement, they allowed my cat to come and stay with us as long as he lived in our suite and didn't roam the house, but he was free to be out when the girls weren't there. We toured the property prior to our decision in midsummer. Our guide was a former sister, and she showed up late for our appointment. After 10 minutes of waiting and peering into the giant dusty windows of the mansion, I was ready to leave. This seemed like a really foolish idea to me all of a sudden. The place was huge and intimidating. My husband wasn't as impatient as I was, and the woman eventually showed up with a huge ring of keys without apologizing for making us wait. She led us into the mansion under this grand portico. The air conditioning had been turned off for the summer because no one was in there, and dust flew around in the overbright directional afternoon light, blinding us as we entered. A feeling of luxury pervaded the place, and something very lonely, too. Antiques stood stoically and sunk into the thick carpets next to the carved staircase and the leaded stained glass. The house was grand, with a gracious foyer flanked by two large living rooms, with tall ceilings and beautiful moldings. It was truly a testament to conspicuous consumption, and it had been built in the 1880s. The sorority took it over in 1940. There were 18 rooms and 3 stories, plus the cavernous basement, all sitting symmetrically under an elaborate slate roof. The address was one of the oldest in the town, and it looked over a now-defunct quadrangle nestled between 2 Gothic revivals. While showing us the humble suite we would live in, 2 rooms and a bathroom, our docent waxed with reminiscence about her time spent in the house as a sister not so long ago. She kept asking me, "Do you know what I mean?" But she didn't wait for a response, which was good because I could not relate to her glory days as a sorority sister. As we descended into the basement, carefully avoiding the wet stones, I shyly asked her if the place was haunted. My husband shot me a look of caution. She laughed nervously and said, "I've never encountered anything scary here, although this basement does give me the creeps. And it was a frightful place, and I hoped I would never have to be down there by myself." Near the bottom of the stairs was a theater-like space, childishly painted with Greek symbols and cloaked in heavy curtains. We learned that this place was where the sisters gathered for their secret rituals. We were asked to never bother the girls or interrupt them while they were in session, except if there was an emergency, of course. We both suppressed giggles, but then realized how serious our guide was about this warning. After sleeping on it, we decided to go ahead and give it a try. I had some trepidation, but was pretty much up for anything. We moved into the small suite in the middle of August. The weekend the girls moved in was hectic and overwhelming. I began questioning the wisdom of our decision right away. My husband, who was raised with two big sisters, was no stranger to girl behaviors, but he was outnumbered and mostly hung out with Ted, the cook, and the dishwashers. Our suite was right above the part of the basement where the sisters did their secret meetings and ceremonies. As forewarned, we were barred from anything to do with their rituals, and we had to leave them alone. I found this aspect of sorority life to be very silly. Unfortunately, we quickly learned that we could hear almost everything they said through the heating and cooling ducts from their basement lair. Their rituals were really just gossipy meetings, lighting some candles and singing some songs. During Thanksgiving break, we discovered the bowling ball. The first time since moving in, we had the house to ourselves, and the cat was allowed to roam around. He ran up and down the grand stairwell and would spring out, tail puffed, back arched, and hissing. He scared me so many times doing these faux attacks that it also made me laugh because he really was a scaredy cat. The bowling ball was purple with sparkles embedded in it. A stamp on the side revealed that it had been stolen from a local bowling alley. We found it on the second floor in the hall, gleaming in the afternoon light. We didn't think much of it. It was just another weird thing in the sorority house. The girls came back for a month and then left again for the winter break. I noticed the bowling ball started traveling around the house. I never saw anyone carrying it or rolling it, but I saw it in the living room one day and out on the second-story balcony where I was afraid the girls would drop it on someone's head. Given enough alcohol, anything was possible. Stupid, dangerous things happened regularly on Fraternity Row. After winter break, the fraternity next door suddenly closed down after a disastrous drunken party that resulted in the death of a cat. The front door of the frat house was boarded up, and a sign was attached from the health department that read condemned. And that was our view from the sweet small windows up until the end of our service there. When I was alone in the house, I often thought I saw things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows and twinklings of light. I heard sighs and squeaks. The dark furniture seemed sinister and judging. Portraits of sorority sisters from the 40s and 50s silently watched from their ornate frames. How was it possible for women so young to appear so old and knowing? I liked to recline and read in a window seat at the front of the foyer. As the weak winter light extinguished, I would shiver, feeling watched, and head back to our shabby little suite and turn on all the lights. I told myself it was nothing. My husband did not go in for ghost stories, so I kept thoughts to myself. By the time spring rolled around and the girls finally went home for summer break or graduated, we were beyond weary. Our patience had been tried in ways we hadn't realized would be possible. Clothes, shoes, belts, food, and trash littered the bedrooms after the girls moved out. We were astounded by the waste and the filth. A cleaning crew was called in, and then we had the place to ourselves until August. A strange, silent lull fell over that property. We were surprised to discover the bowling ball remained after the professional cleaning. It sat in the carpeted hallway on the second floor, next to the room over the portico. On a rainy and uncharacteristically cool evening in June, we were in our suite talking and relaxing. Slowly, we became aware of a strange scent. At first it was subtle, and then it rose up and became sharp and musty at the same time. Not like a cleaning fluid and not a noxious fume. The smell had a hint of earth to it, but something spicy too. It tickled our noses, and it was impossible to ignore. We both stood up and looked around, puzzled and confused. What is that? After sniffing the vents of the basement and looking outside to see if we saw smoke, we sat down. There was nothing to indicate what the smell was emanating from, but we were rattled and discussed possibly going down into the basement to see if something was wrong with the furnace or the air conditioning unit, but we made no move to do it. The hairs on the back of my neck and forearms were prickling. Behind the clouds, the sun was slowly going down. The rain now tatted on the window panes. We looked at each other with round, frightened eyes as the strange odor suddenly dissipated. One moment it had been there, and the next it was gone. We sat in silence. We started to laugh nervously at each other's frightened faces. We needed to shake off our fear, but before we had a chance, a loud, crashing thump interrupted our giggles. Above our heads, something very heavy had fallen down onto the hardwood floor of the room above us. The impact of the object shook our room and rendered us silent. Then a rolling sound could be heard. Something heavy was rolling across the floor above the suite. Despite panic, we both shot up out of our seats and headed into the main house and up the staircase. In the dimming light, we saw that the heavy pocket door to the room over the portico was partially open, and inside the room, leaning against the threshold, was the bowling ball. We both called out, "Hello, hello, who's there? This isn't funny, who are you?" My senses were heightened and my ears were ringing, listening for any sound that would indicate an intruder, but I heard nothing. My husband slowly approached the door and slid it open, expecting to find someone inside. 2 twin beds flanked the walls. The mattresses had been stripped and turned. A window seat like the one in the foyer was about 12 feet away under an ornate large window. A floral cushion matching the draperies on the window seat bore a deep indentation in the center as if someone or something had been sitting there. We both cautiously walked over to the cushion and stared. It appeared that the bowling ball had been sitting on the cushion and then somehow fell to the floor and rolled to the doorway. We checked the hardwood floor and indeed found an indent. No one was hiding in the closet and the room was empty. We looked at each other with caution. We were not giggling anymore. That ball was in the hallway the last time I saw it. Me too. You didn't move it, did you? No, I don't like to come up here unless I have to find the cat. Could a cat drop a bowling ball? We decided our cat was not the culprit, but that was cold comfort. I wasn't convinced that someone wasn't in the house. We left the bowling ball where it was and walked into the hallway. It was now getting dark. Without warning, a clatter could be heard on the 3rd floor. We turned and looked at each other with disbelief. At this point, I'm pretty sure I was making a frightening squealing noise, and I do remember jumping up and down. With fear and panic rising, we turned toward the narrow wooden staircase that led to the former servants' quarters. The smell of dust and wood pervaded my senses. This was the least adorned part of the house. No plaster on the walls, just wood. There was a distinct battering sound, wood on wood. I was clinging to my husband as we edged up the stairs and into the hallway. The rhythmic banging was coming from the bathroom at the end of the hall. We had to pass many closed doors to get there, and I was sure someone would jump out at us. When we opened the bathroom door, rain and wind lashed the curtain around the surrounding of an old clawfoot tub. Carefully pulling back the curtain, the source of the offending din was revealed. A small window above the bathtub had become unhinged and was flapping and slapping hard against the casement in the wind. One of the panes had cracked. It wasn't hard to pull it shut and resecure it. In the quiet that followed, I sat on the edge of the tub and took deep breaths. We found our way back to our suite after checking each room to see if anyone was indeed in the house, and no one was. Our cat was in the suite and he was sleeping. We never discovered what that smell was or how the bowling ball fell and propelled itself across the floor. The clattering window seemed to be an act of nature. I wonder if the spirit of some mischievous sister came to tease us that evening, or perhaps there are logical explanations for all of it. Regardless, I won't soon forget it, and we were very happy to move out of the sorority house. Well, that's my story, and I thank you for using it if you choose to, and I love your show, and I'm going to say take care.
And here's a story from Justin in the U.S., The Ghost Down the Road. This story happened not only to me, but also to 4 of my friends. It was the summer of 1999, just before we started high school. The 5 of us were all very close, and several years before, we started making our own movies together using handheld video cameras. We would write, shoot, and act in these little comedy short films. We would do them sometimes as book reports for group assignments, while some of them were meant to simply amuse ourselves with. Less than a year prior to this, my family had moved into a small subdivision out near the county line. It was full of quaint houses and still fairly wooded. The neighborhood consisted of about 3 main roads, with many cul-de-sacs coming off of them. We lived on one of those cul-de-sacs. This particular night, the 5 of us had been at my house all day shooting our newest movie. The plan was for everyone to stay the night, since we would pretty much have our run of the downstairs. We would have food and movies and all the other things that go along with these great childhood sleepovers with your friends. That night, probably a little bit before midnight, we all decided that we wanted to go take a walk around the neighborhood. We were no doubt full of caffeine and energy and had no intention of sleeping any time soon. As we liked to do when we were all together, we brought the video camera along with us for filming our outing. We took off down the road, talking and making jokes in whispered tones as to not anger any of the neighbors by making a lot of noise at that late hour. We walked out to the end of the road and onto one of the main roads in the neighborhood, making our way to the next cul-de-sac. This little road was maybe 50 yards long and had a slight hill before dipping down into the turnaround. We crested the hill, and in an instant, all talk, all chatter, all laughing stopped. The 5 of us stood there in silence, looking down at the bottom of the small hill. Off to the left, there was a house with a streetlight out in front of it. By the house was a small mailbox and a trash can. There was nothing weird or sinister about the house itself, but standing near the edge of the driveway, near the trash can, and under the streetlight, was a figure. We could all tell instantly that this wasn't just a person standing in their driveway, because this figure glowed. I can remember what it looked like as if it were yesterday. It was a little taller than the trash can, maybe 5 feet tall, and even though it stood under the streetlight, I couldn't make out any details. All I could see was a bluish-white glow that seemed to be emanating from it. "Do you guys see that?" one of my friends whispered, but I don't remember anyone responding. Just then, the figure began moving. It wasn't so much walking as it was gliding, and when it got to the road, it turned toward us. It seemed like I had been staring at the thing for minutes, though I'm not sure the whole thing lasted more than 30 seconds. I turned to look at my friends, only to realize that they had quietly and rapidly began walking back down the hill. I realized I was alone at the crest of the hill, with this glowing figure moving toward me, and I panicked. I took off running, and the sound of my running scared my friends into taking off at full speed themselves. The 5 of us raced as fast as we could down the road and back to my house. We got to my street, and just as we hit my front yard, I heard 3 very distinct sounds. A man's voice yelling something indistinguishable, a bunch of dogs barking, and finally a woman's scream. We threw open my front door and bolted downstairs, none of us slowing down at all until we were in the safety of the house. Downstairs, we all struggled to catch our breath, and then fearfully tried to work out what had just happened. All 5 of us agreed on what we'd seen, what it looked like, and that it had been moving. It didn't take us long to think, hey, we had the camera with us, let's look at the tape. We put the tape in the VCR, keep in mind this was 1999, and gathered around the TV to watch. The whole incident played out exactly as we had remembered, with one major exception. The glowing figure was nowhere to be seen. My friend had been filming the exact spot where we saw the figure, but on the tape there was nothing there, just a driveway with a mailbox and a trash can. Only a couple of us claimed to have heard the sounds as we got back to my house, so I was curious to see if the tape had picked them up. We fast-forwarded to that part, and while the video was the dizzying footage of someone running with a camera, sure enough you could hear the sounds, a man yelling, dogs barking, and a woman's scream. We spent the next few hours talking about what it could have been, and about 2 or 3 in the morning we convinced ourselves that the best thing to do was to go back and see what was there. We thought surely it must have been something that looked weird under the street light that had freaked us out, but was just completely innocent. We slowly and silently walked back in the middle of the night, and when we got there all we found was a house with a driveway, a mailbox, a trash can, and a streetlight. There was nothing remotely that looked like the glowing, featureless figure we had all seen. The next morning we told my parents what had happened, and decided we would go back over there in the daylight. When we did, the owner of the house was working out in his yard. He was a friendly guy, probably in his 50s, and he listened to our crazy story from the night before. We asked him if he had heard anything outside the night before, or if maybe he himself had been out and around at that time. He couldn't help us, as he hadn't seen or heard anything. And none of the other neighbors who we asked about if they heard any yelling or screaming the night before. No one had heard anything. Several months after this, my parents told me that they had found out something that we may find interesting. A few roads down from my school in the middle of town, there was a lot where just a chimney stood. Clearly a house had been there at one time. Apparently, several years before, that house had caught fire one morning and burned down completely. While the parents had survived, both of their children had been trapped upstairs and died in the fire. The parents, as it turned out, were the people who owned the house down the street from us, where myself and our 4 friends had seen a short, glowing figure walking around in the driveway in the middle of the night. The story is from Rich in Townsend, Delaware. Valentine's Visitor. I live in Townsend, Delaware, but this experience took in my childhood home in Long Island, Valley Stream, New York. I'm now age 37, but this happened probably about 30 years ago in 1987. My parents, when starting out, lived in a small house. When my younger sister and brother were born, there was no more room on the upper level where my room had been, so my father, being pretty good with tools, took it upon himself to finish off a good portion of the basement for what would be my new room. The house was old and creepy, especially the basement, but the section he completed was actually pretty nice, and it was finally ready for me to move into. It was on the eve of Valentine's Day, when my father finished up my future room. He had painted it and moved all my furniture down to the room. He took all my posters and wall coverings down from my old room as well. It was all ready to move into, but since it was in a basement, The paint on one of the cement walls had taken longer than expected to dry, and because of the paint fumes, I was unable to sleep there the first night, so my parents told me to sleep in my old room at least one more night. So with a nice spot on the floor, and with a bunch of blankets and my pillow, I was comfortable and dozed off quickly. I was awoken at some point in the early morning by a noise. At first, I laid there groggy, unsure of why I had woken up. I tried to doze back off, but I heard it loud and clear. It was the sound of knocking and tapping on the wall in the room. It was to the right of where I was laying, and I heard it over and over again. It was as loud and as clear as someone clapping their hand against the wall. I laid there paralyzed with fear, a 7-year-old in the middle of the night with nobody to turn to or help me. At that time, my father worked nights, and my mother, although only across the hall from my open door, seemed like she was a mile away. Also, I had a fear that if I moved or tried to get out of the room, whatever it was would get me. Either that or increase their presence to another level, and I was too scared to find out what that might look like. So I laid there for what seemed like hours, listening to this noise over and over again, until the cool light of the dawn entered my room from the window. At that time, I finally summoned up enough courage to look at the direction the noise was coming from, because the noise had finally stopped at first light. There was nothing that I could see that was any different. The wall was blank, and there was nothing there that could have been hitting or flapping around. Again, my room was completely blank of furniture, posters, and everything, so I still cannot explain what could have made these noises. I eventually got up and went to school that day. I tried to explain the noise to my mom and grandfather in the morning, but they both said it must have been a dream. The real creepy part was when I returned home from school that afternoon. My father was home, and I walked in and put my bag down and had a snack. I went outside to play and was going about my business as a 7-year-old when my father angrily yelled for me from the front door. He said, "Rich, get in here now." Confused at why I was being addressed with this tone, I went in and asked what was wrong. What did I do? He told me to come in and he would show me. He led me to the room that I had just slept in the night before, where I had my experience. He told me that as I was coming to get the blankets and pillows to move them downstairs, I saw this. His hand was pointing toward the wall where the noise I had heard was coming from. To my shock and disbelief, there were about 30 to 50 separate handprints. It looked as if someone had taken their hand and was stamping their handprints all over the wall at different heights and places across a good 10-foot portion, side to side. The prints were not in paint or anything like that, but they were as if someone had a dirty hand and just hit the wall again and again. I instantly said I didn't do it, and excitedly tried to explain what had happened the night before. My father wasn't having any of it, or listening to it. To him, he had just painted and worked hard at setting up my new room, and now there was this mess upstairs that he was not going to have to clean up. He told me to get a sponge or a rag and get to business cleaning it up. Again, I tried to prove my case and show him that the handprint was not mine, because when I put my hand up to it, it was clearly smaller. The other point I tried to make, but which was falling on deaf ears, was the height of the prints. He had taken all of my artwork down and moved the last of my furniture out the day before, and he said himself these prints were not here when he did that. To which I replied that if there was nothing there, like my desk or chair, then how do you think I would get up high enough to make these prints at the top of the wall closer to the ceiling. They were a good 3 to 4 feet above where my fingertips could reach. He actually had no answer for this, but he just replied, "I don't know how you did this, but you're going to clean this up, each and every one of them, because you had to have done it." To this day, I do not know what caused them or how they got there. And that's it for Anything Ghost number 244. Thanks to everyone who got involved in show number 244. If you have a personal ghost story you want to share, send it to lex@anythingghost.com. And don't forget about the Anything Ghost VIP group. Get the complete 12-year archive of Anything Ghost by checking out Anything Ghost VIP group. That's at www.anythingghost.com. And then check out the Join the Anything Ghost VIP group